everybody, Tony D with Screenwriter's Tip. I had a very sort of specific question. Wasn't really a question, but I needed another video for tonight about Mafia stuff. One of the commenters is working on a Mafia script and is trying to figure out a good era to set their Mafia story. So I just like to briefly sort of break down some of the major eras in the world of the Mafia. For a more detailed Mafia timeline, I built a Mafia timeline of all the major sort of Mafia era events I could find in a book I did called Complete Mafia for D20. Now, it's a game book. It combines Dungeons & Dragons rules with the Mafia. Come here, Joan. You want to come up? Oh, what a good doggy. So if you want the super detailed, list of actual events, you might want to get my book. There's also an Italian timeline in my other book called F.U. I'm Italian, Why We Italians Are Awesome. That one's more Italian-centric than Mafia. There's some Mafia stuff in there. The Mafia timeline in Complete Mafia goes up to the year 2000, I believe, when John Gotti passed away, I believe, or went to prison. Did he pass away? I think he passed away in prison in 2000. Let me start at the beginning. So the beginning, the very early prototype Mafia eras. First, there are the Italian Vespers, and they start in 1282. They're not really Mafia goons as we know them. They're more of a secret society that is trying to liberate Sicily from the French, the Avignon French. It wasn't really France. This is 1282. It's prior to a lot of city-states or nation-states that we know. So the Italian Vespers were secret. They rose up when, legend has it, a French soldier insulted a Sicilian woman, and that was sort of the last straw. It was Easter Day. They rose up and they massacred the French. They just killed them all. The next sort of major era is the era of the sort of Renaissance and pre-Renaissance and into the Renaissance era Mafia guys. Again, they're not quite Mafia. What happened was the Spanish had taken over most of Italy, and on mainland, what would be mainland Italy, the Spanish also brought with them La Gardina. This was a criminal organization that came out of Spain, and they were a prison gang. And they built themselves up, again, more kind of a secret society with hoods and knives and daggers, and they would skulk in the shadows and do secret ceremonies, and they would kill people and rob people and do all sorts of nefarious things. There was also a third faction in Italy that they were called the Gabellati. The Gabellati were land managers for the Spanish noblemen. See, the Spanish ran Italy, but they didn't actually go there to collect all their money and crops, essentially. It was all sort of shipped out, and they got the proceeds. But the Gabellati were in charge. They were kind of like the prototype mob bosses. You couldn't really get justice from the occupied Spanish soldiers, but you could get some kind of justice maybe from the Gabellati. And they were very powerful and kind of corrupt. So when you combine the Vespers along with La Gardina and the Gabellati, you eventually get the Mafia. So the Mafia comes about sometime in the mix between the 1500s and I think there's a date, I forget when it is, the word Mafia was used. Now keep in mind it was a secret society, so it could have been around for years and years prior to that, and nobody said anything or wrote it down because it was a very secret society at that time. But by the time you get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Mafia is an organization that's in Italy. It operates along with the Camorra and a few others, and they they do the kind of extortion sort of crimes. The Black Hand was notorious for extortion, shaking people down. If you didn't give them money, they would throw a stick of dynamite through your window or whatever. So they followed to America because there was a lot of competition. There was actually too many mafia figures in Italy. So as mafia or as Italian immigrants came to America in the early 1900s, the mafia followed suit. A lot of these mafia members were guys, maybe made guys who broke the rules or didn't quite follow the rules. They were considered outcasts in their own way. Some of them weren't. Some of them just saw the opportunity in America and could see the money. The mafia was in the United States as early as the Civil War and right before. They actually started to come in around the 1850s in Louisiana. So there was a community of Sicilians, and there actually was a mob war, and it got so bad they actually lynched some of the Sicilians down there in Louisiana. And it was a problem for all Sicilians, not just the mafia members. So you have the Civil War era. That would be a very interesting era. So any time after the 1850s, you could have mafia guys running around. Of course, in the late or early 1900s, they would mostly be in New York and the East Coast. That's when they start to come in there. By the 1920s, Prohibition rolls around. Now, the mafia sort of made their bones during Prohibition in terms of their wealth and power. The Irish and the Jewish mafia basically kind of were more established a little bit. The mafia was moving up, but they weren't quite there. And they kind of joined forces at first with the other families. But they were more organized. They had more of a structure and more guys, quite frankly. They were like the newest immigrant. The Irish had been around for a long time, but they didn't have the numbers. And the Jewish mobsters absolutely did not have the numbers. There were not that many of them. However, the Sicilian mobsters did team up mostly with the Jewish mobsters. The Irish eventually got pushed out. And during Prohibition, even the Jewish mobsters eventually sort of just, retired or got pushed out. The Irish were like forcibly pushed out, whereas the Jewish mobsters just kind of left and retired and took their money. I mean, Meyer Lansky was considered a friend of Lucky Luciano and a mentor. So there was a lot of good relationship between those two groups. But at the end of the day, Prohibition made the mafia in America. They made a ton of money. Al Capone made money, Lucky Luciano, all these groups. And then Al, of course, brought too much heat, and eventually it was his downfall, but there were plenty of other families. So all through after Prohibition, they had a ton of money. Then you see Bugsy Siegel building Las Vegas. And this sort of peaks right around the mid-50s with the second big commission meeting. The first one is in, I believe, is it 1929? It's on my chart, where they had to discuss, business across the country. All the families came together in Atlantic City. But in the 50s, when they tried to do it again, it was kind of a disaster. And they portray that, a little bit of that, in the movie Analyze This. If you've ever seen that with Robert De Niro, how that meeting just blew up in everybody's face. Some cops got wind of it, and then the next thing you know, it was a humiliating defeat for the mafia, and they never had a commission meeting again after that. So the peak of the mafia's power really is kind of around the early 60s, because right after that, you start to get problems. They're too high profile. They're too big. They're into the Teamsters, and that draws the attention of the federal government. So during that era, you get, The Irishman, if you've seen that movie on Netflix. And that's when the feds start to roll in. Robert Kennedy starts to, investigate these guys, and they start to get exposed. They're not very secret anymore. Up until about that time, they were pretty secret. Even right up until the 50s, they were fairly secret. But by the end of the mid 60s, kind of everybody starts to hear about the Mafia and what they're about. Then, of course, movies had portrayed the Mafia for a while. They didn't really call them the Mafia right at first. They were gangsters. The bootlegging era kind of made them famous, but they weren't, the Italian part of it wasn't really promoted. And then slowly but surely, you get into the 70s, and, the Mafia's profile is just way high. And you had guys who had been big bosses in the 50s. Now in the 70s, they're just too visible. So the cops eventually start cracking down, and by the 80s, they really come hard at the Mafia. And they hit a lot of walls, but, the feds, they just changed the rules. And so you get the RICO Act, and part of the reason they can keep you in jail with no bail at all was because of John Gotti. They had tried to keep him in jail again and again and again, but he had so much money he could always get out. So then they changed the rules to make it, okay, he's a danger to the community and he can't get out of jail now because we changed the law. And that was, all about Gotti. So you've got kind of the peak in the early 60s, and then it kind of a decline as the U.S. government goes after them. They're high profile, and they start, people start turning state's evidence. And then by the time you get to the 90s and 2000s, you really have problems there. I mean, after they put Gotti away, that he was sort of the last of the big flashy bosses. After that, everybody kind of learned their lesson in the families, like, we can't be flashy. We should do what Carlo Gambino did, is live modestly, stay under the radar. And they realized that Gotti just brought way too much heat. So that's what they tried to do. There you get the Oddfather. It was one of the Genovese bosses who pretended to be senile and crazy. He lasted a long time. That worked for a long time. You get, you get kind of a disintegration. You get Ralph Natali. Is that his name? I want to say Ralph Natali. Was it Ralph Natali? The Philadelphia Mafia boss. He was sort of the model for Junior on The Sopranos, and he turned state's evidence. He's the first boss to flip to the feds, and that was a huge blow. The Philly mob, kind of after that, it kind of never really recovered, although it's hard to tell because I think they've gone underground. They've become more secret again. So they may be flourishing, and who knows? They may have just decided, well, we have to be extremely secret now, and then maybe they're doing very well. It's kind of hard. After a certain point, it's hard to tell because, each era, you really have to see the era, 10 years after it happened, because that's when you get all the court cases and you get all the information. So, right now, in the world of the Mafia, there's not a tremendous amount going on, but I suspect they're making a boatload of money during the virus because so many places are closed, and Mafia organizations and organized crime in general thrives during these oppressive times. So between the riots and the beer virus, I promise you, these guys are taking advantage of it. So, for instance, you had all these businesses that were closed. Non-essential businesses were closed. The Mafia doesn't close. So if you needed something, those guys would get it for you for a price. The bars are all closed in New York, right? The Mafia bars are not closed. There are probably a whole slew of illegal bars, casinos, little drug houses, whorehouses. They're all operating in the city. Still, even with the pandemic. Same thing with these riots. If the rioters need something and they got money, hey, that's no problem. They better not burn anything in Little Italy or anything that the Mafia runs, because I'll tell you right now, the rioters would regret it greatly. Um, unless they wanted the rioters to burn down a place so they can collect the insurance money or, cause damage to a rival's turf or whatever. They're always working an angle. Never count the Mafia out. Those guys, they know stuff. So the eras are clear. You got the bootlegging era. Pre-bootlegging is good. It's more low key. You got everything post bootlegging where you get this huge peak where they have tons of money, and then you've got sort of the, I reluctantly call it a decline, but it's kind of hard to graph, but kind of decline, sort of settling back to more pre-bootlegging levels. Not quite the same, or it's the new quote unquote bootlegging organization, but with sort of the pricing of the Mustache Pete's, because now they have to resort to being extremely careful. They have to do things. They have to commit the sort of crimes that you can't videotape, that you could do online, or stuff that people won't prosecute. They can't do these big things anymore. They don't control as many cops and government people as they used to. They just don't have the bankroll necessarily. They may do it through other means. They may do it through blackmail or, just getting enough information on people to turn them. And, they do have resources. I'm not saying they don't have resources, but it's different than when it was. So, if you're going to set your Mafia world, there's all kinds of different ethnic groups which fascinate me. I just found out recently about the Finnish Mafia. I didn't realize the Finns had their own mafia, and that to me is a fascinating little thing. So the place and the ethnic group is important, but usually when you talk about the Mafia, you're talking about the Sicilian Mafia. There's great differences between the American Sicilian Mafia and the Sicilian Mafia. Real Sicilian Mafia, quote unquote, those guys do not do prostitution. They absolutely will not touch it. They find it, beneath them. Whereas the American Sicilian Mafia, they have no problem with that. Lucky Luciano was a pimp. So there are all those subtle differences. There's also the Camorra and, I can't pronounce the name. It's in Complete Mafia. La Stida is also an interesting. They're the Albanian Mafia. Those guys are scary. They're kind of like the Mafia version of Al Qaeda. They operate in cells. They don't have a hierarchy. It's pretty wild. If you do your research, and my books are a good source of that. You can find a cool place. Also, it depends on the part of the country. If you're picking America, Philly is very interesting. I know a lot about the Philly families if you read about them. Atlantic City, somewhat. It's kind of like the Philly guys up until a point. New York, of course. And then there are places, weird places like out in the Midwest, where there are mafia guys. Certainly out in L.A. and places like that out in the West Coast, down in Florida, anywhere there's opportunity, there's usually a mafia guy somewhere. One of the interesting things I've found too is some of the ex-mafia guys, guys who, like, I know that Joey Merlino apparently is out, but, he moved to Florida, and I believe he was either arrested or went to jail on other charges down there. Something like that. I'm not quite sure. I didn't totally follow the story, but I thought that was interesting. The idea of these mafia guys who are sort of ex-mafia guys, but they're still up to something. So that may be fertile ground, depending on where you want to put your story. But, in the modern era, it's all about surveillance, man. Whew. They just can surveil anybody, and you got smartphones and smart TVs, and any electronics is a problem, is a real problem. You say anything wrong, especially a high-profile guy like Joey Merlino, let's say, they'll get you in a second. Especially if you've got a record. a guy like him, he can't even go into the casinos in Atlantic City. Not a lot of the mafia guys can't. So they've shut off certain areas. Back in the day, the mafia guys skimmed from the Atlantic City casinos before they counted the money. That's how they got away with it. Like, they'd bring the money into the counting room. The mafia would be there waiting. They'd skim a bunch of money, and then they would count it. So it was never on the books. But there's a million stories, and I hope that was helpful. I'm sure you'll be able to pick something. Do your research. That's my advice. Do your research.